Excellent. Welcome to everybody. I'm going to host the Future Generation Intergenerational Equity event, which is one of a series of breakfast events organized by the Institute of European Environmental Policy and partners within the coalition Think2030. In a few seconds, I'll share a few more slides where I will introduce you to the background of this event. It is going to be set in a way that we'll first start with can you show the second slide, Christina? I think that you stopped sharing, at least this is what I see. Hello, Christina? Can you please share your screen? Something happened? I'm sorry about that. It was working, of course, perfectly 10 minutes earlier. And now? Lovely. Okay, so the Institute for European Environmental Policy is a sustainability think tank producing evidence-based research and policy insight. Back in 2018, the Institute with partners has launched the initiative called Think2030 as an evidence-based and non-partisan platform of leading policy experts from European think tanks, civil society and private sector. The main goal of the initiatives is to produce science policy solutions for a more sustainable Europe. A series of papers have been produced within this initiative and discussed at the Think2030 conference last November. And these papers have been a collaborative effort, and our event is actually launching one of those papers, which was produced in close cooperation with European Youth Forum, Generation Climate Europe, and some of the other participants in our panel, and especially Charlotte Unruh. I'm going to present our speakers in a second. Here you see the paper itself and the link which you can follow in order to reach the paper if you haven't done so. The paper itself actually provides a series of recommendations of how the current policy context can take better into account the rights and the interests of future generations, with the view of integrating those within the process of the implementation of the European Green Deal, the upcoming 8th Environmental Action Programme, the recovery package, and all the recent policies which were enacted within the European Green Deal. Can you move to the second slide? Excellent. I'll leave you very briefly through the agenda of the meeting and the scope. We are quite fortunate to have with us Ms. Claudia Hahn, Policy Officer from Director General Environment, Global Sustainable Development Goals, and Green Finance and Economic Analysis Unit, who is going to address us with a keynote speech. We'll follow up with a short presentation of the paper, emphasizing on key analysis and recommendations, and move on with a panel discussion of with the involvement of some of the contributors to the paper, and also partner representatives of partner organization to IEP and Think2030. I will start with Agatha Meissner, Director of Generation Climate Europe, Jan Meyerhofer, Policy Officer, European Youth Forum, Karolina Fabianova, Project and Communications Manager, Youth and Environment Europe, and Charlotte Unruh, Ambassador, Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations. We'll follow up with a session of a question and answer and reflections from participants. And at the end of the panel, I'll introduce the house rules and the approach we are going to use for this section of the event. Now, with no further delay, I'm going to give the floor to Claudia for her introductory remarks. Thank you very much, Claudia. You have the floor.
Good morning, Svetlina and everyone. Do you hear me? The sound is fine? Yes. I'm nearly surprised that it's again the old people who have to start. So I thought it's more for us to listen to you, but it's really very nice to meet you all. I have seen some of you already. I'm really thankful for all of you and for IAP for having done this paper. I think you have really put this very important focus on bringing the social and the environmental side together, because I think of all the environmental dimension, it's still the dimension which is less developed, including the intergenerational, but also the more general inequality issue. So this is really an important aspect. I mean, I think you have heard it several times now from our commissioners. I think people are aware that young people are paying the highest price in this crisis. On the one hand, you have the upcoming climate and environmental crisis, which of course will affect you more than us, because we will not be there anymore. And at the same time, I mean, your whole life path was a bit put out of order thanks to the health crisis, for which you have less risks than we, and nevertheless you have contributed to protect us. So I think we have really to make a big effort to thank you for all your efforts. I think from the European Commission, the biggest contribution to intergenerational justice is the European Green Deal. I think the European Green Deal, it is really to protect our and your future, because it really recognizes, and this is perhaps for the first time in a political world, that there are laws of the nature which we cannot continue to ignore. So there are the planetary boundaries and we have no choice. The social well-being, economic growth, everything depends on healthy economic systems. And this is now really clearly recognized by the European Green Deal. All this, and you know it, would not have happened without you, because the pressure from the Fridays for Future and the other youth organization has been really instrumental in making the European Green Deal happen. We have made a Eurobarometer last year, which confirms that climate change is a priority, the top priority of EU policy for 67% of young people. I have to say, sometimes I was even positively surprised myself, because we are sometimes told, oh, it's only part of the youth, it's only those who are more privileged. So, but I'm really reassured that it's really for everyone, and that 67% of young people agree. And from my side, I can tell you that it's, even if young people have a specific stake, I would say that for environmentalists and climate activists among the older people, this long-term thinking is really part of the DNA of environmental policy. So we really are very happy that now you also put so much focus on the green side. I think most of you know the European Green Deal, so I will not enter into details here. Just to recall that the European Green Deal is building a new economic model. The annual sustainable growth strategy explicitly recognizes that economic growth is not an end in itself, and that the economy must work for the people and the planet. So there is a clear commitment to the well-being concept, and we want to make this happen through a transition to a climate neutral, resource efficient and circular economy. You know the recovery package, there's a considerable part dedicated to climate and biodiversity spending. And then we have a whole lot of policies to make business more sustainable. The taxonomy is important to direct private finances towards the sustainable businesses. And then we are promoting a tax shift. So I think this is also very important for young people, that the taxes are not primarily put on labor, but on pollution. I mean, it's an ongoing project, it just started, but it's very high on the agenda also after the G7. And then there are more policies particularly dedicated to young people, like the skills agenda, which aims at building future-proof jobs, and an upcoming council conclusions on education for sustainability to make sure that this is built into the education from the beginning. We know that this is not all, and in your paper you have made very good, very precise, concrete proposals, how to ensure that our policies, our legal proposals are future-proof. And I would just like to inform you that very soon the Commission will come up with updated better regulation guidelines. And I think there are a lot of things which are really, really in the line of what you have been asking for. There is a new tool. I just mentioned a few names here. If you want to have more detail, we can come back to it. There's a new tool on the do no significant harm principle, which is the core principle of the Green Deal to ensure that other initiatives don't affect the environment. There will be a new tool on SDG mainstreaming, which covers, of course, all SDGs. There will be tools which build on the calculation of the environmental footprint. This is something we have been asking for a very long time to ensure that not only the EU internal footprint, but also the external footprints of our products is taken into account into our policies. And there will be more focus on foresight, which is, I guess you know what is foresight, so it's these methodologies to better calculate and anticipate what are future trends to make sure that our policies are not too much focused on the short term. And of course, in this better regulation agenda, there is a lot of space for extensive public consultations. And I would say here, comes your participation. And I think there are two ways for young people to participate. They can either participate as experts who have a very strong and detailed knowledge on certain issues, or they can participate as, like other societal groups, just representing the future generation. I think the better regulation is very much focusing on the experts perspective. And I mean, I already looking at IEP, there are a lot of young people who are really very, very strong experts on a lot of issues. And I think there is these extensive public consultation and dedicated stakeholder consultations are already a very good opportunity to comment on specific policies and sometimes technical things. But then there's also this broader issue of how can we better involve young people in the general policy debate. And there the Commission has taken a lot of initiatives very recently. I mean, I don't need to tell you about the EU youth dialogues. You have been very heavily involved in this. You know that in DG Environment, we have several projects running with you to protect biodiversity, the environmental ambassadors, which will also be part of the climate pact. And then very recently, last Monday, I think it was, we have nominated an EU youth coordinator. It is someone who is sitting in DG EAC. It's my colleague Bilina Sirakova, and her task is to really be a coordinator for all youth issues and to bring it back to the politicians within the Commission. The conference on the future of Europe will have a dedicated strand to collect the voices of young people. And again, I think most of you here, of the speakers, you know it. There is a dedicated consultation ongoing about Youth Goal 9, which is a youth goal which aims at ensuring the participation of young people in the political process. So the consultation is still ongoing until the 15th of June. And I think this is a very good strand to ensure that your ideas really go to the heart of the politicians. I think this is all I would like to say for the moment. There's so much, and I'm happy to come back to some things more in detail if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Indeed, we are very much looking forward to the better regulation tools, which are so relevant to our discussion and can definitely provide this clear mechanisms to ensure, to the extent possible, the future generation and future impact. I have been to an event yesterday where actually Vice President Sunita mentioned that within the conference for the future of Europe, the European Citizens Panel will be composed of 1/3 youth representatives. as young as 16 years old. So this is also an excellent news and very much along the lines that you have shared. I hope that the new youth coordinator will be a actor who will be really channeling the interests of the youth and will be able to actively reach out and connect. Indeed, very good overview of all the relevant development initiatives within the Commission. Thank you so much. I will now give the floor to Christina, who will briefly lead you through the key messages and recommendations of the paper. And then we'll move on to our panelists and have a targeted discussion. Christina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I will just need my slides, please. If someone could share the screen. My name is Christina. I'm a communication and policy assistant within the People-Centered Environmental Policy Research team. Very briefly today, I will present the paper that was published early this year. I will start off with the key messages and we'll finish with the key policy recommendations. As I said, I will be very brief, so I encourage you to have a look at the paper if you haven't, and carefully read what was written and proposed. So to start off, this paper highlights that Europe is at the tipping point of no return when it comes to climate change, biodiversity loss, resources depletion, and reaching the planetary limits. It also points out to the fact that Europeans are currently dealing with multiple crises that has been worsened by the pandemic. In this context, the authors of this paper say that the Commission will have a crucial role in shaping the lives of the current young generation and future generations. And the European Green Deal will present an excellent opportunity for the EU to have wide action in order to ensure intergenerational equity is embedded within the recovery process and beyond the pandemic. Next slide, please. Again, with the key messages, we have seen throughout the last few years a rise in climate change youth activism, which led to issues of intergenerational justice and solidarity to be at the top of the political agenda within the EU and the UN. Therefore, inclusion of equity, fairness, and justice within climate policy is highly essential for amplifying the voices of future generations. And lastly, institutional change will be able to mitigate the lack of democratic representation for future generations. Next slide, please. Now I will explain you the key policy recommendations. There are 8, and as I said before, please carefully read the paper if you want to learn more about these recommendations. So the first one is that the European Commission should provide long-term impact assessments of current policy plans, programs, proposals, and investments. Future proofing was the term used in this paper, and it should be backed by the precautionary principle and also the latest scientific evidence. Another policy recommendation is that the annual sustainable growth strategy should be complemented by a 2050 strategy for sustainable prosperity, which would include indicators on well-being, sustainability, and intergenerational equity, upon which progress from member states will be assessed. In addition to that, attention should be paid to issues concerning inter and intra-generational social equity. And the impact assessments that I just presented as a first policy recommendation has to be co-created by a wide range of stakeholders, with EU youth playing a key role. And these results should be integrated in the implementation of many environmental policy instruments, such as the Zero Pollution Action Plan, the implementation of the biodiversity, chemical strategies, EU climate law, and the EU Green, as well as the 8th Environmental Action Programme. Next slide, please. And then last, for policy recommendations, the European Commission should continue to structurally integrate youth in the policy and decision-making processes. And this should continue to build on the foundation of the EU Youth Strategy 2019 and until 2027, and the EU Rights of the Child Strategy concerning engagement, connection, and empowerment of youth in civic and democratic life. The sixth policy recommendation is that this structural integration should take the form of youth advisory bodies or citizen assemblies by coordinating with youth networks for each member states. And we have seen the launch of the conference on the future of Europe, which took place not long ago. And this could be a very interesting opportunity to enable citizens, especially youth, to engage in a wide-ranging debate on Europe's future directions and public policy. And last but not least, the European Commission should explore the long-term implications on member states of COVID-19 and the recovery packages. And this should pay particular attention to the issue of long-term debt to ensure that it falls in line with the principle of a just transition and leaving no one behind. So these were the key messages and the key policy recommendations. And for the next slide, I would like to present the leading questions of the debate as well as the paper. And I will encourage you to reflect on these questions. So the first one being, how can be delivered an effective and intergenerational equitable response to the climate emergency and the interconnected crises now? And the next question is, what are the steps needed to ensure intergenerational equity is sufficiently embedded within the European Green Deal and the recovery process following the pandemic? So that's it for the presentation of the paper. I will give the floor to Svetlina, who will start the debate on these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, for making this very clear overview. Indeed, as you suggested, there are more recommendations and ideas in the paper itself, and you can use it for further reference. For us, it will be very important to hear what additional recommendations and ideas you have within the context of the focus of our discussion today. And I invite you all to use the question and answer menu down in Zoom to include there your ideas, your suggestions or questions, which the panelists can take on board. You can already start using this menu, and I'll be monitoring while the interventions of the panelists are ongoing. Indeed, we're going to address these two questions, and I'm giving the floor now to Agatha Meissner to address us and start the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Agatha.
Thank you very much, Svetlina, and also Christina for organizing the event today. I'm very glad that we are here to discuss a topic that is this important. So my name is Agatha Meissner. I'm here today to represent Generation Climate Europe. For those of you who don't know, Generation Climate Europe is the eldest coalition of youth-led networks at the European level that specifically focuses on pushing for stronger action from the EU on climate and environmental issues. So in that sense, our mission is to create that platform for young people to advocate for a green and just transition in Europe. And maybe let me just start with a short definition of intergenerational equity, because I'm not actually sure that all of our participants today are familiar with the concept. So the whole idea behind intergenerational equity is that it's a principle that essentially articulates this idea of fairness among generations when it comes to use on conservation of the environment, its natural resources. So essentially not making a distinction between the rights that current generations have in the past and future generations, making sure that they are equally involved and engaged in the process. So when it comes to the policy context, obviously today the big focus is on the European Green Deal. And with the European Green Deal and the new von der Leyen Commission, something that happened, which was very welcome, was that climate and environmental issues became much more central in decision making, with areas such as biodiversity and circular economy really receiving a much more attention and specific strategies at the EU level. But the problem is still that the underlying mission does not sufficiently address the causes of the climate crisis. So I'm glad that Claudia mentioned that there is some in recognition of the importance of the well-being economy and moving beyond GDP indicators, but there's definitely not enough attention when it comes to the actual causes, as the European Green Deal still is promoted as a growth strategy. And that is kind of the underlying mission of the strategy, even though there have been numerous scientific studies that show that it's essentially impossible to decouple economic growth from environmental pressures. And in that sense, there are also not, even though that is targeted, there are not enough reduction targets when it comes to both production and consumption. So linking that really to ensuring that, despite the fact there are multiple strategies addressing a lot of very urgent environmental problems, the underlying idea of the European Green Deal still is very much focused on economic growth, which is very problematic. And now the reason why this is important is because the policies that we have right now, they have to be designed in light of their long-term impacts on people and the planet. So this is kind of where this concept of intergenerational equity comes in and why this is so important. When you think about the decisions that are taken today, the consequences will be dealt with the current young people, that they will have to, they will be the ones dealing with them in 15, 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 years. The problem is that they are not sufficiently involved. There are a number of initiatives and mechanisms currently in place, which Claudia also mentioned to you, but the young people are not sufficiently engaged in a structural and in a regular manner. So the idea of this structured youth engagement revolves around this concept that, it's not just a one-time event or a one-time conference where we invite a lot of youth organizations and young people, even if it's a bigger consultation, but we really focus in this long-term thinking in incorporating mechanisms of participation. So ensuring that these mechanisms are not dependent on political momentum or friendly stakeholders that we currently have that are, let's say, friendly towards the idea of having more young people in specific meetings or conferences, but really ensuring that this becomes a right, that this becomes a regular thing. And I think from my experience, something that, Generation Climate Europe and European Youth Forum, for example, we've been collaborating on this quite a lot. And something I think that sometimes is unclear is that, we don't go to these meetings and we don't advocate for these things because we want to have more room ourselves. We are essentially creating mechanisms for other young people, for other Europeans through our democratic structures. So it's not this idea of, we're lobbying for more space for Generation Climate Europe, for European Youth Forum. We're really there to represent young people and Europeans and youth organizations through our structures. And I think that's something that is really important because it's commonly misunderstood, I think, when we advocate for these issues. So there are already, when you think about current policy process and European international level, there are some examples. Maybe some of you know the Advisory Council Leave of the Council of Europe. But I think what's very important, and also in the context of today's debate, is to really put a special focus on climate and environmental issues. And that is one, because of the urgency of the current crisis, but two, also because the future generations will be the ones most affected by the decisions that we're taking today. So in that sense, I know there have been some efforts. I mean, the EU Youth Coordinator was mentioned, which is it's from a week ago. So I think Generation Coverage, we're still to see a bit what the structure is going to look like, how is it going to be implemented, and what is it even going to mean that the EU Youth Coordinator is going to represent and gather all youth. There have been, I know there were some efforts done also from the Commissioner Leyen from the International Partnership to create a youth sounding board. But I think something that is important to realize is that at the EU level, actually, there aren't sufficient mechanisms for that. There are some efforts and discussions on how to make it work, but at the current stage and the current status of the mechanisms and the structures involved, we don't actually have sufficient mechanisms to ensure that that young people are structurally and regularly involved. So from DC side, we've been trying to respond to that need and organizing these youth climate dialogues. So we started last year with engaging with the Council presidency, and this year with the European Parliament, making sure that we do create that platform for engagement. And also with the European Youth Forum, we have been working closely with the European Economic and Social Committee, looking into different areas in which we can more actively engage young people, again, in that structural kind of regular manner. So how can we incorporate really long-term solutions? But obviously, the focus shouldn't really be on just young people coming up and saying, well, hello, we're still here. And, our interests still have to be considered. These have to be systemic solutions. So in that sense, something I also wanted to mention is that I think a lot of the debates are focused exactly on that. So, how can we engage more young people? But that's not necessarily enough, because when we think about intergenerational equity, young people might not actually be best placed to represent future generations. There's this idea of this burden put on young people currently that they are in the best place to represent future generations, which is just not true in the way that we function right now. So the focus should really be on making sure that we safeguard the rights of future generations to natural resources, to clean environment, to a healthy planet, and that intergenerational equity is included in all decision-making process. So something that was mentioned and Christina also highlighted, this idea of future-proofing of all policies, making sure that these long-term impacts are considered at all stages. That is very important. But something I wanted to highlight is I think there's still, when we talk about EU policies and EU discussions, there's still a really big focus on, the targets for 2030, the targets for 2050, which is great. But, we go beyond that. I mean, current young people, in 2050, I'll be 53. So there's still a lot of life to live there. And I think there should be a much bigger focus on really thinking beyond that. So we don't really get stuck in, we only have targets for 2030, we only have targets for 2050, and whoever's going to come next is going to deal with, 2070 and so on. So really thinking more long-term, in the sense of really more long-term strategically on how that's going to influence the current young people, but also the future generations. And in that sense, something that again brings me to that discussion of moving beyond GDP, moving to other indicators. I mean, there's been discussion on well-being, on sustainability, but also why not intergenerational equity as being that indicator of where we're moving with our economy. So that's something really important. There have been some efforts being done on thinking, strategically and structurally and institutionally about future generations. There's, some of you might be familiar, there's a Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, and why not have a European Commissioner for Future Generations in Europe? I mean, this would really make sure that we can very much mainstream this idea of intergenerational equity in all policies. So yeah, just to wrap up a little bit, so we can also hear from our other wonderful speakers today. There's this idea of making sure that, and I think that's really important, making sure that intergenerational equity, as it is crucial for responding to the climate crisis and in the post-pandemic world as well, really mainstreaming it into decision-making processes, so that it's not only young people having to remind about the importance of thinking about it, but it really is at all levels of decision-making process that this is considered. And that responsibility and that burden should not be on a couple of stakeholders, a couple of organizations, but really introduced in the institutional structures that we operate in. So in a way, I think it's also a mindset change, which I think is always challenging. You know, it's kind of taking a step back and looking into the system that we currently operate in and how do we want to change it. But I think it's really, really important that in that mindset change, really make sure that that intergenerational equity concept is considered at all levels.
Thank you very much, Agatha. I think that now there is a common recognition of the need for a structured cooperating mechanisms which would ensure long-term cooperation and engagement of the youth, which is excellent. Indeed, now there are different discussions on what will be the right means and the right tools that can be used for that. And you have already mentioned some which are being discussed in different forums, like the ombudsman idea for future generations. But what really took me, your suggestion to have a intergenerational equity indicator, which definitely is an innovative and interesting proposal that we can elaborate on further. Thank you so much, Agatha. I'll now move to Jan. You've mentioned a few times your cooperation, Agatha, with the European Youth Forum. Jan, you have the floor for your message and intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlina, and hi, good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Svetlina said, my name is Jan Meyerfer. I'm working with the European Youth Forum, which is the umbrella of youth organizations in Europe. We have 107 members all across Europe, and I would say that there are maybe two things that put us a little bit apart from other civil society organizations. The first one is that we're youth-led. That means that both our board and the board of our members is composed of young people, and they make the strategic direction of the organization. And the second one is that we work in a democratic way. That means everything we adopt as policies and we go advocate for towards the EU institutions is democratically approved by our member organizations in a general assembly that we have twice a year. So yeah, first of all, I would like to congratulate the IEP and all the co-contributors on this paper on a really, really important topic, I think. And I think the paper really gives an excellent summary of the issue and the ways forward, especially in terms of procedural change. I think here very, very important, for instance, the adjustments to cost-benefit analysis that are currently not working, for instance, when we talk about future discounting, and also the structural changes, and Agatha mentioned some of them. So I think in the paper we talk about an ombudsman for future generations rather than a commissioner, but it's essentially the same idea, and I think it's a very, very good and important idea. But I also think that there are some important gaps when it comes to policy recommendations, and I think that's just natural because this topic literally affects all policy areas. So I'd just like to briefly speak about a topic that I think is absolutely crucial when it comes to institutionalizing intergenerational justice, intergenerational equity, and that is fiscal policy. So as you might know, the EU is currently governed by a fiscal framework, the Stability and Growth Pact, as part of the European semester, that has very, very strict rules on what member states can spend and how much relative to their GDP they can incur in new debt. And in its current form, the framework would impose austerity on member state once the recovery takes hold. Like right now, it's deactivated by a so-called general escape clause. That is essentially why this massive investment, the Next Generation EU, was possible. And here is, I think, where intergenerational justice comes in. So we have some politicians arguing that, you know, future generations would have to pay back any public debt that is incurred by governments, and that's why we need to limit spending to be sort of fair to future generations, right? And I think that's really the wrong claim or the wrong argument, or at least a misleading argument for two reasons here. So first, we're in a context of very low interest rates. So currently borrowing is very, very cheap, and we should certainly do it. And the second one, and much more importantly, now is the time to invest in the future. And now is the time to make, investments that will be beneficial to future generations, given the many policy challenges that we have, especially, when we're talking about the climate crisis, but also others like social inequality, unemployment, etc. So we believe that a new fiscal framework that does not impose austerity on member states, it has more flexibility, more democratic accountability, is absolutely necessary and an important part of institutionalizing intergenerational equity. Now, the good thing is that there is an opportunity at the EU level because the EU is about to review its economic governance framework. So that will probably happen once after the German elections in the autumn. That's what we hear from DG ECFIN, that the Commission is going to start this review. And I think it's really, really important that youth organizations, trade unions, civil society, and like-minded politicians get together to work on this, to make sure that indeed we're not going to have a return to austerity like after the last financial crisis. So what we've done at the European Youth Forum is that we've started, and we are part of a coalition of civil society actors, youth organizations, trade unions, academics, to work on this. And we'll have a week of debate in September. And if you're interested in this topic, then please reach out to me. You can join the coalition. We're open to everyone, and ideally also contribute to this week in September, because it's a really, really important topic. I'll share my email address in the chat in a second. And since I maybe have a 1 or 2 minutes left, I'd like to quickly respond to the remarks of Ms. Claudia Hahn, and also what Agatha said in her speech, because I think if we're serious about this, if we're serious about intergenerational equity, it comes down to a different economic model. Now, that is the key task we have. And here I have to disagree that the European Green Deal in itself provides that model, because I think we have to be very, very clear when we talk about what kind of, what is wrong with the current economic model, what is actually our current economic model. And I think, ultimately we can break it down to 3 things. And the first one, as Agatha mentioned, is the question of growth. And the European Green Deal has essentially been, promoted and released as Europe's new strategy for growth, for green growth, that is, but it's still growth. And as Agatha mentioned, there is a lot of very, very good analysis, for instance, by the European Environmental Agency, who says that, well, decoupling growth from its impact on the environment is just very, very unlikely. So this is certainly not the strategy we should go for, but we should rethink growth. And then the second one is the question of ownership in our current economic model. I think, in our current economic model, it's largely private ownership of, what you call the means of production, essentially, the distinction between employers and employees, and obviously, in its modern form of the fact that shareholders are owning the big companies, who have much more of an interest in short-term profits, who don't really have an interest of keeping an organization or keeping an environmentally friendly policy for the long term. So here is another big area for change that I don't think is really tackled by the European Green Deal. So there are a lot of studies out there as well that show that, for instance, cooperatives, where this distinction is essentially erased, where workers own the enterprise, they have much more of an interest in actually, making it an environmentally friendly enterprise, because it will secure also the future of the company itself, right? So this is a second important area that I think the European Green doesn't tackle at all. And then the third one is the question on how we make economic transactions. And I think in our society, what we see, and that's very much related to growth, is that more and more of our transactions are essentially market transactions. So quid pro quo, we're transforming natural and social capital essentially into products and services. And this has a huge effect on both the environment and also on our society. So I think that, this is a big reason why we see that trust, social cohesion, etc., is deteriorating, because essentially you don't have the glue that really whole society together if everything is a market transaction. So I think if we're talking about a new economic model, which is absolutely crucial if we want to fight the climate crisis and if we are serious about intergenerational justice, we need to define our economic model and debate for each of these components really whether they're beneficial for future generations. So thank you very much, and happy to elaborate on any of these points or your questions in the Q&A right after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you for your also different perspective to the issue, focusing on the fiscal and financial aspects of it. And indeed, you mentioned now it's time to invest, and a fiscal framework should not impose austerities, and these investments should be supporting the goals for sustainability. And the taxonomy is one of the Commission's approaches when such clear criteria on defining investments as sustainable are being developed, which is excellent. Thank you so much. Indeed, I'm also urging our participants to address us through the question and answers box, and the panelists will be able to reflect on that after the short interventions now. Thanks again. I'll now pass the floor to Carolina for her introductory words. You have the floor.
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this event, and thanks for having me in YIE, and congratulations on the amazing paper discussing the intergenerational equity, which is a crucial aspect and concept of the whole climate crisis that we are living in. And unfortunately, it's still relatively uncommon and overlooked in most of the policies and in most of the political debates. So I would share my screen, if I may, quickly, just to start. Can you just let me know if you can see? Okay, perfect. So my name is Carolina, and I work for Youth and Environment Europe, and we are the largest independent network of environmental youth organizations, also working quite a lot with Generation Climate Europe and also European Youth Forum, so I'm very happy to see my colleagues here. To talk about the intergenerational equity, I will bring the perspective of the youth participation and youth engagement, as that's something that we are really doing on a daily basis. So just to introduce YE, here you can see the mission and values, and the last one I highlighted is really to strengthen the youth participation in environmental and climate decision making, which is also quite a big topic of this policy paper. So before I would start, I would like to mention that we are talking about the intergenerational equity and justice, and I very much agree with all the points that were raised by Agata and by Jan as well. And I would also like to mention the intergenerational equity right now, because we work a lot with the climate movement and with the youth participation, but what we see is that often in Europe, and especially in the EU policies and at the EU level, the representation of the youth participants when we're talking about the different ways of engagement is often coming from the Western Europe or from the more developed regions when they have the access to better youth participation. So what we are trying to do in YE is really to engage young people coming from the less developed regions of Europe or the marginalized communities. So here you can just see on the maps our members. So I would like to raise this point that this is not just an issue about the future generations, but looking at the current generation of young people right now, we need to also consider this aspect and provide more accessible funding to these regions and to engage people. Maybe they're struggling more with the youth employment, so they don't have that much opportunities. So I would really like to mention this, that this is also an important part of intergenerational equity. So if I would have to mention something that really resonates with me from the paper, is the digital participation in the current climate decision making. So as Agata very well mentioned, often these youth conferences or youth dialogues are one-time events, and what we need to do is really to bring the youth participation and make it structure in the long-term decision making. And I know that at the Generation Climate Europe, they are also doing these dialogues that we are also doing at YE. And I just put here some few examples that actually during the pandemic, we were exploring digital participation, which is something that the paper discussed as well. And it came as very effective. So I would just like to share this success story. And we were able, as you can see here, to engage with the EU ambassador for the Arctic, Michael Mann. We developed a cooperation, we had the youth dialogue, and then in the end, it aimed to writing a policy paper on the recommendation of updating the Arctic policy. At the same time, we had the dialogue with the Director General of DG Klima, Mauro Petricione, who also took our views into account. So this digital participation is sort of very effective when it comes to long-term engagement, but as Agata said, it cannot be just like outsourcing to the youth conferences and youth people. Like it really have to become to the level where it's a cooperation and co-management. And there's in the paper a few amazing examples on how we can do it. So I would really like to push this idea of incorporating the youth participation and more than just EU Green Deal and go beyond and put it into all policies, because in the international generational equity is not just the environmental issue, it's also a social issue, and we need to like really incorporate it in the whole framework that we are living in right now. Then the second thing that I would like to mention are the green skills, which is something that is also mentioned in the policy paper. And we are talking a lot about the green jobs that comes from the EU Green Deal. But what we see in reality, working with young people, that they often don't have the green skills to actually do the green jobs. And I'm talking about the soft skills. So that's what we are trying to do as well, is to provide them training courses, webinars, and workshops to develop these sort of skills. And we see that, for example, now in the new Erasmus program, there is a mention about the green skills, and there is like a huge emphasis on it, but it's still something that we need to, again, incorporate beyond the environmental dimension. So to put it really into our education and to focus on empowering young people with the skills. So then in the end, they're able and effective to become these experts that we were talking about and become really engaged with the politicians. And then the third thing that I would like to mention is climate litigation, which is also a way of somehow gaining the intergenerational equity that we are talking about. It's also not mentioned that in the paper, so that's what I would like to bring it in. And recently in May, actually, we've seen a few huge developments, like starting with the Shell that you definitely heard about, that the lawsuit was bringing onto Shell, and they have to actually lower their emissions, not raise. Then we have also other examples where the German court asked the German government to revise the climate targets because it's harming the future generations. So that was like a landmark that comes from Germany, that they are asking to do this for the future generations. So also there was this example in Australia where they said that the new coal projects cannot cause harm to children. So the courts are getting into the climate litigation, and they're talking about the future generations and not to harm them. So I think this is also a way to go. Not many people and young people know about the litigation. So we are also trying to bring this topic in and tell them that the law is also a tool on how to achieve the intergenerational equity. And this should be more explored as well when it comes to EU and UN decision makings, because it's often still overlooked. So I would like to just close that. I think that the future generations and everything that have been said before is not just a luxury. It's actually that we are talking about the fundamental rights of a future people. And that's why we need to really get rid of this growth idea that we talked about and start putting this intergenerational fairness into core of everything, and really engage with young people and put them in the decision-making processes, not just outsource them somewhere so it's become a tokenism, but really to listen to them. And we very much welcome this paper because there is a few great ways and recommendations on doing it. So I think that's all from me, and thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A later on.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you for bringing in the discussion the possibilities that digital communication are giving us from one hand side to allow more direct and ongoing participation and cooperation, and from the other hand side to be used as a tool for green skills development. Indeed, the Erasmus program is putting focus on it, and I really hope that many young people will benefit from it. Thank you again also to bring in this discussion the benefit of relevant climate litigations, because indeed the few cases you mentioned, they are quite landmark, and they are going to set the precedents in Europe, and they are also raising the attention of exploiting exactly the rights of future generations as a legal standing basis. So it was indeed very interesting, and thank you for putting this additional perspective to the discussion. Now, Charlotte will put a fourth perspective in the discussion. You have the floor for your intervention, and please also elaborate a bit on your current research, which is relevance. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Hello also from my side, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to comment on that wonderful paper. So my name is Charlotte Unruh. I'm an ambassador for the Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations. For those who haven't heard of the foundation before, we are a young think tank and activist group based in Germany. We raise awareness of intergenerational justice in politics, in business, and in society. And in my capacity as ambassador, I have so far been involved with organizing events and also with working on policy papers on topics in intergenerational justice, including mental health, artificial intelligence. But most recently, I was part of a working group on institutionalizing future justice in the EU, and the works there are still ongoing. And although I do not speak in this capacity today, my thinking is very much informed by my background. I am a moral philosopher specializing in the ethics of future generations. I actually defended my PhD on doing harm to future people earlier this year, and I've also published on these topics from a slightly different academic perspective. So in these different capacities, I try to bring new perspectives to discussions on intergenerational equity. And what I've done today is I have brought three messages with me that I think are very much in line with what's already been said. And I'd like to just quickly share these messages. And the first message is that building back better needs to include a long-term perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, today's democracies with quite short election cycles are often argued to be biased towards the present. Future people, future generations do not have a vote. They cannot influence the political process, right? But today's policies can, of course, affect them, as we know, as we've also just heard. And I think that gives us a really powerful argument for making sure that the voice of future generations is in some way included in the political process. For example, by creating institutions that represent the interests of future people, like the Future Generations Ombudsman that we've heard about and read about in the paper. Such reforms could strengthen existing institutions for future generations, like the one in Wales, for example, and they might also serve as a precedent for additional national and supranational solutions. So again, the first message: to achieve future justice, it is really crucial that we embed long-term thinking in politics. So the second message that I have is that, and that has also been mentioned before, is that future justice or intergenerational justice really spans across different policy areas. And often when we discuss the rights and the interests of future people, the framing is that of climate justice or of environmental justice. And of course, that is a key pillar of, what we might call future justice or justice towards future generations. But of course, we also leave more to our descendants than the environment. Our financial debts, our political institutions, our investments, of course, also, as Jan rightly pointed out, our cultural and social norms will all influence the generations yet to come. And if we look at one policy area in isolation, then there's a risk that the side effects of reforms and trade-offs of policy aims in other areas become neglected or invisible. So a future-directed institution would need to consider the environment, financial stability, risks from emerging technologies, safeguarding of democracy, and probably all kinds of other questions. And I think we need to really look at the whole intergenerational equity issue from a very comprehensive angle. What kind of society do we want our descendants to live in, and how can we get there without compromising our own needs? And I guess I want to put that question forwards for later discussion. How can we make sure that the trade-offs between policy goals for the future are adequately considered, for example, in some kind of institutional new setting? Okay, and the third and last message, I think this is gonna be quick. That is that broad dialogue is key to increasing intergenerational equity. So as we are seeing right now, young people are really vocal about future-related concerns and have been in recent years, which I think is great. That's fantastic. Young people have a really, really important role to play here. But it would be a mistake to frame the issue of justice to the future, of future justice, as listening to the young people, as I often hear that. That's a bit misleading. Many older people care a great deal about the future, and also not all young people have the exact same ideas about future justice, right? So I think we should avoid unnecessarily framing this as some kind of conflict between generations, and I think it is sometimes framed that way. And we should also avoid outsourcing the topic to youth representatives for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned, but also because other actors involved in policymaking or decision making might then see that issue as, being taken care of by the young people and maybe feeling let off the hook a bit. In the end, I think what needs to happen here is that we need to take responsibility as a society for that. So young people, old people, everyone in between, we really need to envision our future together. And that requires us to have a broad debate across generations and across belief systems. And so if we're not open to different visions of the future, then we might risk alienating those who do not see their views taken into account. So I think this broad debate and some of the initiatives that have already been mentioned are a great first step towards this, but I think this really big public consultation process on these issues is really something that we need here. And another question here that I think it would be interesting to think about more and maybe discuss is how we can make sure to work together rather than against each other on the big challenges that lie ahead, and how we can ensure that we include very diverse voices, from different generations, but also from different cultural and social backgrounds into that discussion, into that debate that lies ahead of us. So those were my 3 points. Thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you for bringing the need to make sure that no policy area is taken in isolation, as you put it. Indeed, we are very much focused on the climate implication to future generations, on implication on nature, environment, but indeed a holistic approach is necessary. And such approach should be indeed taken jointly by all the actors, not to put the burden, as you put it, on the shoulders of the youth. And I also find very important that we should reach out and work with the non-like-minded people, the people that need to be converted and engaged, because often in I wouldn't call it confrontation, but in a constructive dialogue, you can reach the feasible development and something that might be accepted, owned by everyone, and then sustainably implemented consistently and long term. So I very much appreciate your points on that. Now I'll give a few moments to our panelists if they wish to reflect on some of the interventions from the panel. Before we start taking the questions, you can raise your hand if you wish to take the floor for comments or for reflection on what was said so far by the panel. I'm addressing the panel first. All right. It looks like we are like-minded people, and we are having a joint understanding about the issues at stake. I will put forward some of the questions. I'm afraid the first question, which was very much focused on incorporating peace and disarmament in the work to protect future generations might be a bit beyond the scope of today's meeting. I'm not sure if any of the panelists will be able to reflect on that, but I will read the question out. What can be done to incorporate peace and disarmament in the work to protect future generations? The Youth Fusion is discussing this, but not many other youth, climate, or future generation networks are focusing on the need for peace and disarmament to stabilize the climate and protect future generations. I wonder whether some of the panelists would wish to address this question. As I say, it is a little bit beyond the scope of the meeting today. Let me know. I think, Christina, it will be best that you stop sharing the screen because I can't see all the panelists somehow. Lovely, thank you so much. Okay, yes, as I was afraid, it is a little bit beyond the scope of this work. And I will move to the next question, which is, how do you raise perception of the issues to the least well-educated young generation? How you actually engaged with such who are not currently engaged into the discussions on the future of climate? What can be done? Carolina already mentioned that the youth and environment is trying to reach out to regions which are less privileged in terms of access to funding and access to networks. Maybe you can elaborate on this question first. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think from the bigger perspective, I think the accessible funding and providing opportunities, because when it comes to writing for projects, because we are also a youth-led organization, and probably you all know that the project writing is often a very complicated bureaucratic process that people from less developed region might not have that much knowledge about. So maybe making the funding for them more accessible, maybe doing small grant schemes could be a solution to this. What we are trying to do at YE as well is that when we have different training courses or something, we are able then to provide a sub-funding to the participants. So what we usually do is that the participants learn something as the green skills for the training course, and then we encourage them to go back to their local communities, and with a small amount of grant, we somehow support them to develop their own local project there. So then that way they're able to elaborate on what they learned and also empower the community, bring some new perspective and impact. So I think when it comes to reaching out is often a case of the funding and of that accessibility. And then also we have different barriers, of course, like the digital connection that we are right now working with, and maybe youth employment as well. That's its big topic still, because when people cannot have this basic necessities, obviously then they cannot participate in something that is like above their daily needs. So I think it's like, again, when we go back to the discussion, that we have a structural problem that is very like deep down rooted in our society, in the mindset of growth. So I think this is also the change of the mindset that we need to do.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Does anyone of the panelists would wish also to reflect on this question, or I can move to the next one? Agata, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to add quite briefly on kind of two main points. I'm very glad that Carolina mentioned funding, because I do think this is a really massive problem. And, you know, when we talk to our members and other youth organizations, funding always comes up as a barrier. Not only the lack of availability of possible funding sources, but also this idea of how technical and how much of an administrative burden that can be. So in a way, making sure that, you know, we address that, I think it's very, very important. And in particular, I think focusing on other types of education, you know, not just formal education, but also informal and non-formal education is very important. Recognizing the role that it plays I really think there should be much stronger emphasis on that. Obviously, then when it comes to discussing that in the context of the EU, there's then a discussion of the responsibility and the division of responsibility between the EU and the national member states. But still, that discussion has to happen with a much stronger emphasis on non-formal education, I think. And a second point I wanted to highlight here is, and I'm also very glad that Karina mentioned this representation, is, when it comes to decision-making processes, if we look at the EU institutions, the levels of representations there are very low at the moment. Even looking among the EU member states, going to events like that and engaging with decision-making makers, there's a very strong underrepresentation or overrepresentation of Western European countries and underrepresentation of countries, for example, from Central and Eastern Europe. So myself, coming from a country in Central Eastern Europe, from Poland, I see that a lot. I think identifying another person or another organization or decision-making active there, and really making sure that this is also a topic put in the agenda, is something that is always very, very challenging. And looking at the kind of actors and stakeholders that are engaged, there is always that idea of, we have to start, if we're talking in the EU about representation and diversity, we really need to start at the core, because there's so many problems we already have when it comes to that representation. It's not just countries, really. I mean, this links back again to youth, this links back again to gender equality, for example, to underrepresented region minorities, marginalized communities. It's a much bigger discussion, of course. I mean, in the context of today, we're focusing on young people, but it's a much bigger discussion when it comes to the kind of actors that are underrepresented. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point, because I think this is something that is very important when it comes to discussing the accessibility of it. Because when you think about a young person from a country that is potentially underrepresented, what happens a lot is, especially when you start getting active, when you're a teenager or so, it makes it much easier to be able to identify a certain actor or stakeholder or person within the decision-making processes that you can identify with, that you can link to, that you recognize is doing a certain work. And it's a very simple first step to understand that there are people from your country, region, group, whatever it is, the type of characteristic that you would apply, that are active and are doing that work and are engaged. So being able to build on that and also connecting with other actors in that area, I think it's a really massive first step and really a massive enabling factor, especially in the initial stages of engagement.
Thank you very much, Agatha. I can't agree more. I'll pass now the next question to Jan, because it is about income austerity. Should there be high income austerity? Because if we just put more money in the system, it's really hard to ensure that all of it goes to green investments. Can you comment on that?
Sure, I can give it a try. Thanks, Veselina. So, I mean, I'm not 100% sure what is meant by high income austerity. So is it like austerity for member states,
countries? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like what the question I think aims at is, because I mean, when we're talking about fiscal policy, I think what we have to make a distinction between the quality and the quantity of spending. And I think what the questioner suggests is that, you could have austerity for, higher income countries, because, for them anyway, it's really hard to ensure that, it goes to green investments. And I think that the quantity is really, really important, because what we see that if there is austerity, even in high income member states, the most vulnerable are the ones that suffer first, right? Because the investments are essentially missing in, for instance, the healthcare system, unemployment benefits, employment schemes, etc. So I think that the quantity part is still really, really important. But I think it's a good question, because ultimately we also need to talk about the quality, and that's why there's the development of a taxonomy. It was actually tabled by the Parliament a few years ago to introduce a so-called golden rule that would then make a distinction between green investments that would not count towards these numbers, that essentially say, okay, only can spend that much. So I think that both is really, really important, but I don't think, we can make this distinction of, that let's say lower income member states can just spend as much as they want, and then higher income member states would have to have austerity. So I hope that answers the question, but in summary, I think both discussions about quantity and quality of spending are both really, really important.
Thank you, Jan. There was a clarification coming. For example, taxing high-income people more, because more money they have, the more emissions they will provide input to. That was a clarification. I would like now to address Carolina with a question on what are the needed skills, education-wise, to increase, green skills for young people. What is needed in terms of policy and education to increase green skills for young people?
I think here I would like to mention what Agata already came across, and that's the non-formal education, because of course we can talk about the formal education and universities, but then again, young people coming from these marginalized communities or less developed regions, they might not have that good access to universities. So then we recognize a big added value actually of the non-formal education and these sort of like alternative form of education. And I think they should be given bigger recognition than they are right now. That could be also volunteering. For example, we are working with the European Solidarity Corps program that you probably all are familiar with. And when young people travel to this volunteering opportunity and they're working fully with some organization that develop amazing skills, but then still in some people's mind that's just like volunteering and it's not given that recognition that it could be. So I think talking about the education, we can also explore these sort of more unconventional form of educations and give it a bigger recognition. And also we could also include the internships. Let's say we see that young people are motivated and ambitious and they want to do the internships, but then again, often there are not enough capacities or they're not paid still, although that become better recently, but still we see some of these. So I think making this sort of opportunities for young people accessible beyond the formal education and beyond the schools and universities, I think it's a great way to develop green skills or any skills actually.
Lovely, thank you so much. I don't see more questions coming in, so I would like to invite the panel for their last notes, maybe your key takeaway from this meeting, so that we proceed towards the closing of this session. Thank you so much. Who would like to start with a key takeaway from the discussions? And I will not raise hands, you can volunteer to start. With your closing remarks, if you may. Charlotte, you have the floor.
Yes, and I think I would like to start with something. I just saw a couple of questions popping up in the chat about the rights of future generations and responsibility towards future generations as a matter of justice. And I guess that triggered the ethicist inside me. And maybe I can just very briefly say a sentence on that as a kind of closing remark, because I think that it is true that the question how we should understand the rights of future people and how can people who don't exist yet have rights and what do they actually mean and how do we weigh them against present political interests. These are all really tricky questions and they are hard to understand, and there's not a simple or easy or straightforward solution or answers to how we should answer those questions. And I think what I've taken away from this discussion now is that it is really, really important to have this conversation, to include many different actors in that conversation, also to make sure that different perspectives are being heard, from different people with different backgrounds, educational backgrounds, different generations, but also people with different views on all sorts of policy goals and policy areas. So, and I'm really, really glad to hear that all these the wonderful panelists here all have their own great projects underway that try to facilitate exactly that. And
yeah, I also really hope that that will happen much more and in more institutionalized form in the future. And I think if that happens, that would be fantastic and a really great first step towards a better and intergenerationally just future. So thanks again for this discussion and event. That was great.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. In the remaining couple of minutes, would someone else of you would like to address with key takeaways? And yes, Claudia, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have not intervened in the panel, so at least I will tell you my key takeaways. I mean, I'm really happy about this debate and for all the great ideas you have. And I particularly liked the idea that who carries the burden of representing future generations' needs. And I couldn't agree less. I mean, of course, it should not be for young people who have also just their life to go on. And I hope that we in DG Environment contribute a little bit to what you try to achieve. At least my personal commitment is exactly about that for you, for my children, and egoistically for myself, because it corresponds to my values. I would like to reflect to just one few of the more technical points which have been made. Interesting comment one of you made on the 2030-2050 objectives. I think it was you, Agatha. I agree, 2050, you are still young, at least you have still alive. And I would say, I would like to be a little bit more nuanced. I think it depends on which kind of objectives we have. If our objective is to have climate neutrality, I think the 2050 objective is fine, because climate neutrality is, if you speak about net emissions, then I think it's difficult to make more. Otherwise, we have indicators where I fully agree. If we say we want to halve waste, then 2030 target is not sufficient. So I think we are making really good progress on having targets which are absolute, which are not linked to 2050 or 30, but because perhaps you know that with the agency and the Joint Research Center, we really try to calculate planetary boundaries. And really to be able to say our planetary boundaries for nitrogen is this, and we are here. And so it's not about 2030 or 2050, it's about the boundaries of the planet. And I think this is what we really need. It's a donut concept, which you perhaps know. In the end, I liked the idea of having an intergenerational indicator. Would be very interesting to look into this. We will certainly suggest it in different work strands we have on monitoring. In the end, all this is the question, as you said, Jan, about what kind of society do we want to have and what kind of economy. And on a personal level, I couldn't agree less with all of what you said, but I also know that the Green Deal is a kind of compromise, because, as also others of you have said, we need a compromise, otherwise we fully alienate some of, okay, if I'm sitting in Europe, so let's speak about member states, but if you go, I've been in some council meetings where I was nearly shouted at by some member states because the Green Deal is about to destroy the economy and the people. So if we think we are just doing the opposite, we want to save the people, but there are other people who are not yet there. And I think personally, I'm amazed how far we have already come in just 2-3 years with the Green Deal, which I would have never thought possible just 3 years ago. So this risks of alienating, I think it's a really important issue. I mean, as a German, I'm totally shocked. 3 weeks ago, we thought we would have a Green Chancellor, and now the newspapers are full of, oh, the Greens want to raise the petrol tax by 16 cents per liter. I think it's really not enough, but it's already leading to the Greens leading the vote. So this just shows how careful we have to build a narrative. Like I saw in the chat saying, taxing rich people more. I'm not sure this will bring us the political success we want to have. So this is the reason why we in DG Environment, we now speak together. We are working on this also with IEP on taxing pollution instead of labor. I think it's a narrative which is easier to accept for a lot of people rather than saying taxing the rich more, even if the result is the same in the end, but it's easier to take people along. And then just as a final remark, I mean, Charlotte, as having a PhD in political science, you know, in the end, the aim of the institutions is to counterbalance our human beings' tendency to be short-term animals. I mean, in the end, we are animals, we have a short-term perspective, and it's very difficult to get people to have a long-term strategy, even if you take about changing your diet to be healthier in 20 years or stop smoking, it's already very difficult. But if you speak about changing the whole economy, not taking your car, not flying, not having holidays abroad, I mean, it's so challenging. So I couldn't agree less that the institutional response is key. And I mean, I'm still very admirative of what they have done in France. It's not perfect, but the climate conference they did, it was not this participatory event where they had people from all ages, all regions, all professions, and everyone who's an expert agrees that the result is stunning. Because at the beginning there were 100 different opposing opinions and they managed to agree. Doesn't say that politicians take up everything, but it proves that if you have the right procedures, people can agree. And this is the thing which clearly gives me hope. And I'm so thankful that you are doing so much to have these kind of debates and to move this debate forward.
Yeah, Claudia, you have wonderfully outlined the key messages of this discussion, and you have done my job, and this allows us to finish exactly on time. I really hope that this is a beginning of such discussion and exchanges, because I truly find it so enlightening and enriching. So I hope we'll remain in touch and we'll collaborate on the issue further on, and we'll be very happy as a group to collaborate with the Commission and DG Environment. Thank you again to all the panelists and all the participants. It's been really interesting. And again, visit the website of IEP. We are feeding in a lot of information and a lot of policy and science interface recommendations on different issues. Keep being in touch with all the panelists and their organizations, because they're really trying to make the change happen. Thank you so much again. It's been my pleasure. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
To everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye.